at WCSP 90.1 FM in the Washington, D.C. area, or nationwide on Sirius or XM satellite radio. To listen to the interviews at any time, visit cspanradio.org or booktv.org. Book TV is brought to you every weekend on C-SPAN 2. Coming up at 8:10 p.m. Eastern, Mao's Last Revolution. Harvard political science professor Roderick McFarquhar on China's proletarian cultural revolution, which began in 1966. Then on Afterwards, New Yorker staff writer Nicholas Lemon describes how racial violence challenged emerging black power after the Civil War. He's interviewed by history professor Herman Bells.
Veterans Day is this weekend, and Sunday, Book TV has special live programming on C-SPAN 2. Beginning at noon Eastern, a live panel with 4 veterans from the Iraq War. They'll recount their time in Iraq, discuss the books they've written about their experiences, and take questions from viewers. At 1:30 p.m., Nathaniel Fick and Dr. Jonathan Shea discuss the trauma of war and what it's like for soldiers when they return home. And at 2 p.m., join a live discussion with authors Stephen Pressfield and Sean Naylor about their latest books and the war in Afghanistan. That's Sunday on Book TV. For a complete listing of programs and times, go online to booktv.org.
The Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution was launched in China in 1966 by Chinese Communist Party chair Mao Zedong. Next, Harvard political science professor Roderick McFarquhar. He argues that the mass executions and human rights violations that occurred during this period set the stage for a more democratic China. This is around 50 minutes.
Tonight, however, we are here to listen to Roderick McFarquhar, author of Mao's Last Revolution. Professor McFarquhar has had a number of careers. He was a journalist with the Daily Telegraph and Sunday Telegraph from 1955 to 1961, editor of the China Quarterly from 1959 to 1968, elected to the House of Parliament representing Belper in 1974, received his PhD from the University of London in 1981, and since then has held numerous posts. And currently he is the Leroy B. Williams Professor of History and Political Science. And please join me in welcoming Professor McFarquhar.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much to all of you for coming. I must say I'm a little bit new to this book signing lark. I thought it was only for people like Tom Clancy and Noam Chomsky. In fact, I've been hoping that some Chinese would stand up at the UN and denounce my book and make it notorious. Because no Chinese is going to stand up and praise it, that's for sure. And that's actually one reason why we did this book, and that is because the Chinese have tried to sweep the Cultural Revolution under the carpet. And last year I was told by quite recently I was told by a Chinese editor, senior Chinese editor, that last year the propaganda department said there will be no celebration of the 40th anniversary of the Cultural Revolution, no marking of it. Celebration, of course, they wouldn't do, but no marking of it even. And very few books actually on the Cultural Revolution have been published in China. A couple, 2 or 3 quite good ones by trusted scholars. And they have hewn the party line, even while they have been saying quite interesting things. And we thought that it was time that the Cultural Revolution should be written about, and there should be a record. As we say, if you look at the dedication, it is a dedication to those Chinese who have informed us with their knowledge and their ideas, but it's also a dedication to all those who will come after us when they are freer to write than they are at the moment about the Cultural Revolution. Why aren't they able to write? They aren't able to write because the Chinese published, as some of you will know, in 1981, they published a resolution on party history which explained the Cultural Revolution. And it did blame Mao for having the the big idea, the wrong big idea of having a cultural revolution. But that's it. All the blame for all the nastiness, the terrible chaos and the killings that went on were pretty well blamed on the Gang of Four, on Marshal Lin Biao, who by then was dead. And the idea of this resolution, as indeed with all party resolutions, is to make sure that everyone starts thinking on the right lines and that they don't go outside those boundaries. And they haven't. And there are people fascinated with the Cultural Revolution living in China, Chinese scholars. They do write, they do talk, but if they publish in Hong Kong, sometimes in Taiwan, but usually Hong Kong. So this is in part an effort, a sort of putting it down on paper for the first generation of truly free Chinese historians to start off with, perhaps. A second reason we did it is because I have been teaching a course on the Cultural Revolution since the late 80s, and for that purpose, since there were quite a few students, I had to have a source book. And as I compiled this source book, I realized that all the writings in English, because these were undergraduates who didn't know Chinese, all the writings in English were dating back to the time of the Cultural Revolution itself, or just after. And basically, it was the history of the victors in the Cultural Revolution, and not the history of the survivors, those who survived the Cultural Revolution, like Deng Xiaoping and all the others. And so, though I think it's fair to say that a lot of journalists, a lot of scholars got things very right about what was happening during the Cultural Revolution, I have to say that because my late wife and myself were also writing about it at the time, though a lot of people got the main threads right, I think it's fair to say that the kind of massive documentation and the memoir literature, the texts of various party internal documents, the histories of individuals' lives, the Nian Pu, the chronologies of party activities, all these things have come out in the last 25 years. And while they are all supposedly not outside the resolution of 1981's format, outside its strictures, nevertheless it tells you enormously greater amount about the Cultural Revolution than the people writing about it at the time. I'll give you one very tiny example, and I want to go on to more important issues in a minute. Stanley Carno, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, wrote a very good book about the Cultural Revolution. I think it was still running while he wrote it. And in a footnote he says, when he was writing about the big military confrontation or potential confrontation in Wuhan in the summer of '67, he said in a footnote, there's some rumor that Chairman Mao was there at the time. Well, he was there. And we know exactly what he was doing there now. We have his conversations with the general who was the danger at the time, or thought to be the danger. And we know how he was quickly smuggled out of the city because Zhou Enlai thought he was going to be killed. I mean, thought Mao was going to be killed. And we didn't know that at the time. So it's this kind of detail that we don't know. We also don't know the kind of detail that came out in a book of memoirs very recently by the the person who was first secretary of the Shanghai Party, not a very lucky post to be in as it now seems, in '65 when the preparations for the Cultural Revolution were starting. Many of you will remember that Mao sent his wife Jiang Qing down to Shanghai to get a scholar, a journalist, propagandist, Yao Yuan, to write an article attacking a member of the Peking Party machine. And this was going to be the first assault on the Peking Party, which Mao wished to dissolve. And suddenly the first secretary died, and a new first secretary was appointed. And the new first secretary was not in on the plot. And the two propagandists who were in charge of the article felt very nervous. So Jiang Qing went to the new first secretary and explained what was happening. And what he should have done, according to party discipline, was to have informed Beijing. He should have informed, actually, the man who was going to be the principal victim, because he was in charge of these kind of cultural matters at the time. But he didn't. Now, I'm not saying that had he done it, there wouldn't have been a cultural revolution. Mao would have found some other way to have had a cultural revolution, but it wouldn't have started that way if it had been all revealed. And it's even conceivable that had people had known in advance that the chairman was plotting this kind of thing, it's conceivable, though I think based on later behavior, unlikely, that they would have ganged up and said, look, Chairman, you can't do this. This is just going too far. We've followed you up till now, but not if you're going to destroy the leadership of the party. So there have been all sorts of things. You've got to cull these memoirs. This particular memoir only came out actually about 18 months, 2 years ago. And the interesting thing about it was that this is a man who many people in the party might have felt angry about because he'd failed to follow discipline and he'd failed, in effect, to help prevent the Cultural Revolution starting the way it did. So this book was only published when all the people in the photographs with him at the beginning of the book, who were all victims of the Cultural Revolution, though they survived, most of them, were dead. So there could be no comeback, no attack on his book saying this book reveals how dreadfully this man disobeyed party discipline. And these pictures were designed to show that all these guys, whom in a sense he betrayed, had forgiven him, because they showed him smiling with them after the Cultural Revolution was over. More importantly, I think one of the things we try to do here is to look more candidly at the chairman's role in the Cultural Revolution than was done in the 81 resolution, and more candidly than people in the mainland can say. Now, anyone who went to China immediately after the Cultural Revolution will remember that people talking about the Gang of Four, talking about the Cultural Revolution, say, yes, the Gang of Four, and they would waggle their thumb to indicate that they all knew that the big picture, the big person was Chairman Mao, and that he was actually made it a Gang of Five. But that doesn't come out in the official histories. I hope that those of you who read our book will feel that it comes out in our book. What I think we try to suggest is that the chairman, as is well known, did not like routine. He was not an organization man. He wasn't a Stalin. If anyone he can be compared with, it was Hitler. He didn't like anything except the big picture, and he left organization and the nitty-gritty to other people to carry out for him. And he loved upheaval. He reveled in the fact that there was civil war going on. When he spoke to foreigners, it sounded as if he regretted it. It was all great tragedy. But actually, when he spoke to his intimates, the members of the Cultural Revolution group, including his wife and others, he obviously reveled in it. And I think one of the things about the Cultural Revolution, not necessarily the main reason why he launched it, is because if you had a straight Soviet-style regime in China, 5-year plans, everything carefully organized, the chairman had no role. He wasn't good at that kind of thing. He wouldn't be setting the agenda any longer. Zhou Enlai could do that. Liu Shaoqi could do that. And he would be cast aside. Not literally, but metaphorically. And I think part of the reason why he launched the Cultural Revolution is that this way he was setting the agenda and continuing to be the real leader of China. And we tried to show that he was as guilty as, in fact, his wife said at her trial in 1981. If I remember the words, I was Chairman Mao's dog, and when he said bite, I bit. And he was absolutely telling the truth. Of course, no one there liked to hear this, but it was true. And we tried to document that. The second thing we tried to do is we tried to have a more realistic appraisal of the last saint in the communist pantheon, because Mao is obviously no longer a saint, and that's Zhou Enlai. And there's always been a lot of stuff said about Zhou Enlai, and the Chinese have said it, that he saved so many people, and he did his best to keep the country going. And certainly the second half of that is true, but he didn't save anyone whom he didn't get permission from the chairman first to save. He did not stick his neck out, ever. And what's more, he actually was chair of one of the committees, the Central Case Examination Group, that actually did the analysis and drew up the indictments of many of his old colleagues. So I think that, in fact, on the mainland there have been some hints that Zhou Enlai is no longer, it's recognized that Zhou Enlai is not, in fact, as saintly as he was made out to be. And in fact, Deng Xiaoping laid the foundation for this in his interview with the recently deceased Oriana Fallaci, when he said in, I think it was 1980, during the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping did and said many things, Zhou Enlai did and said many things he would rather not have said and done. But he didn't specify what, and we've tried to specify. So another thing that I think we bring out is some of the reasons for the Chinese end of the Sino-US breakthrough with the Nixon visit. We have more material that hasn't been published before about what was not known before, which is that during the border clashes on the northeast border in 1969 spring, there were in fact 3 clashes and not 2 as has normally been said, and in the third clash the Russians beat the hell out of the Chinese. And I think that from the Chinese end, we know that Chairman Mao became obsessed with the idea that sometime in the follow-up to those clashes and attempt to bring some kind of peace to the border, that the Russians would launch a Pearl Harbor type attack against China. And it was that that led to the break between him and Lin Biao, in my view. We have a discussion of that in the book about how Lin Biao, listening to Mao, as he always did, he was very careful. He never signed a document until he found out what Mao was going to say about the document. And if Mao had drawn his circle, as they tended to do, he would put his circle also on the document. And on this occasion, he'd been hearing Mao speaking for months and months about the danger of a surprise attack. So what is one of the great generals of the Communist Revolution, the defense minister, the heir apparent, what is he supposed to do under these circumstances? Well, what he should do is prepare the country for this surprise attack. So he decided to do it. And he issued what was circulated as Deputy Supreme Commander Lin Biao's first order. And all over the country, troops moved. Aircraft were dispersed. Ships moved. It was an incredible movement. And in fact, so incredible that I've spoken to people on the American side. They all noticed it. They wondered what was happening. Were they about to attack Taiwan? What was really going on? And since the Americans, I'm told now, were also doing a maneuver to try and frighten the Russians, it looked like there was a lot of military movement going on. But the crux for Chairman Mao was, in my view, the following. Without him signing off on it, though the order was sent to him, Lin Biao was able to move the military. And the military had always been Mao's personal guarantee of safety. And here was someone else who could move the military. And by right. A right given to him actually by Mao himself. And I think that's what frightened Mao, and as we try to detail in the book, that's what leads Mao to start chipping away at Lin Biao's position and eventually to driving him into a corner. And we discuss the flight and the crash and all the rest of it. There's a very good book about this whole episode, 2 very good books actually, one by Fred Tiwis and Warren Sun called The Tragedy of Lin Biao, and then there's the book by the daughter of Wu Fa-hsien, who was then commander of the Air Force, Jin Chiu, who's now a scholar in this country, and I'm blanking on the title of the book. Do you remember what it was, Yo-Chin? The title of Jin Chiu's book? Anyway, Jin Chiu is her name, and it's about the Lin Biao episode in which her father was deeply involved. But what we try to do is to fit this, using their data as well, into the whole pattern of the Cultural Revolution. The latter part of the Cultural Revolution, after the Red Guards had gone, and everyone thanked God for that, and after the Lin Biao affair, which destroyed the image of what the Cultural Revolution was about for tens of thousands of politically aware Chinese. Anyone who had believed that the Cultural Revolution was about something real and important up till that time signed off. They just turned off after that because they began to feel it was just a power struggle. And they'd seen this before. And though it wasn't just a power struggle, it turned people off the Cultural Revolution. And the last years of the Cultural Revolution were stagnant years. Still pretty awful years for China as a whole and for many individuals at the top of the Chinese party, most notably Zhou Enlai, who developed cancer and, of course, as many of you will know, was not allowed to be operated on until the chairman said, oh yes, well now we can spare you for a little while, maybe you can do it. And we don't know if the delay in the operation would have had the decisive effect in Zhou's death, but it certainly wasn't helpful in his life. Well, I could go on and on. There's a lot of pages there I could go on and on about, but I think at this point maybe I should stop and see if you have any questions about what I've said or anything else. Yeah, Alan.
There are so many young Chinese today who are building a new country. They're the successful entrepreneurs. They're coming to this country to study, and they're in their 20s and 30s, and they really have no awareness or even memory of the Cultural Revolution. And they're looking forward. They're not looking backward. And I'd really like to know what you think is the enduring relevance of the Cultural Revolution for this new generation.
Well, I think the most important relevance is, and this is sort of a saying that goes around the China field, no Cultural Revolution, no reform. Had there been no Cultural Revolution, China today would look like East Germany. In other words, a country very competently making the best of a bad economic system. Because they're Chinese, they'd have done it better than most, but it wouldn't be good. And what I think, we draw these conclusions at the end of the book, what I think has happened has been that at the end of the Cultural Revolution, well, let me step back. At the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, a few people had noticed that there was a Japanese miracle. At the end of the Cultural Revolution, especially when Deng Xiaoping really came back to power at the end of the 78, beginning of 79, there were miracles all over East Asia. And China, which had the best chance in 1949 when they took power, when Japan was spread-eagled, atomic bombed, American occupation, Korea was about to be marched over again and again, Taiwan, a beaten relic of the Nationalist Party and army, and a couple of entrepôts, sleepy rural entrepôts in Singapore and in Hong Kong. At that time, China had the chance to surge ahead, and I think the communists must have thought that they would. And what Deng Xiaoping realized 30 years later in 79 is that they'd screwed up. They'd torn themselves apart. They couldn't blame the imperialists. They couldn't blame foreign invasion. They could only blame themselves. And I think that he had no plan in 79. He didn't know what he was doing. He saw what South Korea had achieved in economic development. He saw the sort of stability that Singapore had achieved with economic development. These seemed to be good things, and he wanted to see what China could do. So you know the phrase, crossing the river by feeling for the stones. That's what he did. And gradually, really the 80s was the period of the TVEs, Township and Village Enterprises, collective enterprises, leading the surge of Chinese exports into Walmart and Bloomingdale's and so on. And then the 90s, we've seen private enterprise begin to pick up, and still not too happy with it. So I would say to these young Chinese, and I'll say something about the ones I meet too, I would say to these young Chinese, you really ought to know why you're doing this, because you no longer have Marxism and Leninism as a faith. It's up there as a cardinal principle, but no one pays any attention. You really ought to know why this is happening, and you also ought to come to terms with your history. They're always attacking the Japanese for not coming to terms with their history. I think there's some justification for that. They praise the Germans, but they haven't emulated the Germans. I get Chinese students, some of them Chinese Americans now, their parents came over and they are now being brought up in America, some direct from China, all of them undergraduates in my Cultural Revolution course. And 3 or 4 have written to me or come up to me and said, we're so grateful to you for this course because Granny and Grandpa or Daddy and Mummy never told us anything about it. And I think they just have to come to terms with this history, not just because we need to have them acknowledge, this is what Rum Jong would like to have, that Chairman Mao was something of a monster and that his tomb should be taken out of Tiananmen Square and his picture should be taken down, and I would cheer if that happened. Not just because of that, but because the really terrible part of the Cultural Revolution was that people did it to themselves. I mean, what Mao did was to unleash people. This was not a controlled revolution. That would have been against the spirit of the Cultural Revolution. He unleashed them. Once he'd done away with the party people at the center, the leaders at the center, he said, you know, go forth and make revolution. That's how you're going to learn how to be revolutionaries. And so they've got to understand how important, for instance, the rule of law is, something which you are trying to instill in courts in China, I know, if they are going to prevent this kind of thing from happening, not necessarily on the large scale that it happened in China during the Cultural Revolution, but on smaller scales, because what they did to each other was terrible. Yes, sir.
Picking up on your question and your comments to the question in the same general spirit, as a Jew, I am acutely aware of the Holocaust in my historical experience, though not personal family experience, but it's very much a part of my being. And I'm absolutely stupefied at the reluctance of the Chinese community, be it Chinese or Chinese abroad, Chinese Americans. I don't know if it's shame, a culture of shame, a culture of silence, or what, but it's so contrary to the memory of the victims and a sense of even rudimentary justice, if not judicial justice, to have an awareness of these great crimes that have been inflicted on this great people, and an obliviousness that is, to me, appalling. What do you think is the source of this?
It's very simple. It's very simple. And I want to introduce you to Wang Yo-chin here, who is in fact, has been detailing in a scholarly manner the crimes by students against teachers in the Beijing and elsewhere in the Cultural Revolution. She's not popular with some people as a result. The reason for this is very simple, and that is that Chairman Mao, and Deng Xiaoping said this when they were preparing the resolution, when he was talking to the party historians who wrote the resolution, Chairman Mao is the basis now of the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. All the achievements he had after 49 have been swept aside. Collectivization, nationalization, Cultural Revolution, Great Leap Forward, all abandoned. But he was the leader of the party to victory. And without him, they wouldn't be there. And if you dumped on him, you don't have a Lenin to fall back on, as when Khrushchev denounced Stalin. If you dump on him, what's left? There's no Marxism-Leninism, no Mao. What's the party doing there, except that it's there? So Mao is the last shred of legitimacy, and a very important fig leaf of legitimacy, rather large fig leaf of legitimacy for the party. And that's why they can't go into this. I do have a friend, actually he was Mao's secretary for a time, but fell foul of him, sent away for 20 years before the Cultural Revolution. And when he came back, he became first deputy head of organization. And he wanted to throw out all the people who were guilty of crimes during the Cultural Revolution. And he was rapidly retired because the Communist Party of China was 19 million strong in 66 at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. It was 38 million strong at the end of the Cultural Revolution. You're going to kick out 19 million people, that's another Cultural Revolution. So he was retired, and that never happened. So that, as you possibly know, people would come back. They'd finally be restored to their old reputation, and they restored to their job. And sitting opposite them on the desk was the man who denounced them, replaced them, whatever. And they had to live with that. And I think that it's, I think the grandparents and the parents of young Chinese, whether they're in China or here, who don't tell their kids about this, are really not teaching them a lesson they ought to learn. A terrible lesson. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I beg to differ. I haven't read the whole book, but I find The Last Revolution, from what you're talking, is part of a chain of attacks on the Cultural Revolution and on Mao's leadership that's sort of one-sided and distorted. And your picture of the GPCR that you presented is not just that it's a failure, but that it was a horror, it was anarchy, it was something that should never be looked at again. And I think there's a whole nother understanding of the Cultural Revolution that I'm sure you're aware of, and of what happened in the actual history, and that is to uphold the accomplishments that that happened during that period, and also to look at and criticize and evaluate the shortcomings of that crucial period. And I just wanted to point out that a speaker is going to be coming to University of Chicago, sponsored by the Center of East Asian Studies. And Raymond Latta, he's a political economist and a Maoist, and he's going to give a pretty rousing defense argument about the period of time of the Cultural Revolution. And I welcome everybody who can to come to this. I think this debate needs to be had, and we need to learn, just like you were, the questioner was saying, the Chinese people need to know, but all over the world, I think people really need to know what it was that was the essence of that revolution. And I think that I will study the book. I think the history that you have is important. I don't dispute it. The theme of Raymond's talk is the Chang Holiday book, and I think that's a different kettle of fish. But notwithstanding, I think that there's a value to looking at what was accomplished in the Cultural Revolution that we're not going to get by reading this book, and we should really open our minds to. And so that's at Tuesday, and we have the information here.
The gentleman is lucky not to have experienced the Cultural Revolution personally as a Chinese, and I'd be interested to know if he is able to bring some Chinese along who will say what a great thing it was. Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, I think that you've sort of hit the nail on the head there. And you were talking earlier on about memoirs, and the sort of there's been lots of memoirs in the last few decades that have been coming out, and we can all meet many Chinese who can talk about their experiences in the Cultural Revolution. But two very important words that you haven't mentioned so far at all. One is peasant, one is worker. And these are the people who constitute the mass majority of the Chinese people who can't write their memoirs, because they can't write in English, maybe they can't even write in Chinese still. What you're talking about, you're saying that the Chinese people are like all the same, and they all have this experience of the sort of the urban elite even, who are the people that are writing these memoirs. You're not talking at all about what happened to the peasantry and the workers. And I'm just sort of wondering what you're bringing out that's new in all of this, because we're hearing that Mao was like Hitler. We've heard from this gentleman here that the Cultural Revolution is like the Holocaust and things. What's new about all of this?
Well, I think if you read the book, have you read the book?
No, I haven't.
No. Maybe you won't, but if you read the book, you'll find that one of the things that we have tried to do is to deal with the question of what was happening to people, ordinary people. You'll find quite a lot about that. What we hadn't realized until the work we did and other people's work was the extent to which what was thought by scholars and by ourselves earlier on to be mainly an urban movement was in fact something which penetrated the countryside, and that some of the violence in the countryside was even worse than some of the violence in the cities. So we do try and indicate the impact on the peasants. In fact, in some cases, when cadres were being attacked, the peasants were rather pleased because taxes weren't collected. So we try and, insofar as the materials allow, we try and deal with ordinary people, because of course it was ordinary people who were affected, as well as the elite. But what Mao was about in the Cultural Revolution was in fact transforming the elite. That's what it was about. He wanted to replace what he thought of as a revolutionarily bankrupt set of colleagues whom he'd worked with for 30, 40 years by a new generation whom he was going to give revolutionary experience by setting them loose on the party. And it was utopian, it was mad, and it resulted in him having eventually to call in the army and send off the Red Guards into the countryside. So it was about the elite. As he said in an article which was published before the Cultural Revolution, the fate of the revolution depends upon revolutionary successors. And he wasn't looking for revolutionary successors among the peasants at large, he was looking for them among the elite who were likely to lead China.
I think that he was all about bringing the masses into the history of China, and because the masses are the makers of history, you can't just say that one man or a couple of men decide something and everything flows from that. And so that's where I think that what you're talking about, it's really one-sided in that respect. And I mean, I've lived in China and traveled in China around the countryside for a year, and I've spoken to peasants who tell me in the Cultural Revolution we had barefoot doctors coming for the first time, that we had health care, we were able to get hold of books and study ourselves. We literacy was it became up to 80% from 30% before the revolution. So people have talked to me about that sort of thing, some of it through translation, some of it through my basic Chinese, and I'm wondering why this never comes out in the West.
Well, that has come out, actually. People have written about that. I think that a peasant who said to you that literacy had gone up from 30% to 80% was a very odd peasant who would know those statistics, even if they were true, which I doubt. I think that you've got to realize one thing. I learned about it from a Chinese who I regard as a friend. He told one of my Chinese students, he said, I say one thing to party members, I say another thing to Chinese, and I say a third thing to foreigners. So you've got to realize you stick out like a sore thumb when you go to the Chinese countryside, and I applaud you for doing it and talking to people. What's that? Of course, but you've got to realize that. I think that the idea that you're going to be told that the Cultural Revolution was tremendous by ordinary people in China, well, you must have met some very extraordinary, ordinary people, is all I can say.
What figure do you attribute the number of victims of the revolution?
We have no firm figures on that. There's no way of knowing what the number was. One estimate made by a scholar some years ago was 500,000 dead, many, many more injured, some of them crippled for life. That figure he has now put up perhaps to 1 million, 1.5 million, but these are guesstimates would be honoring them. We just don't know. What I was very surprised at some years ago when talking to some Chinese about the Cultural Revolution, someone volunteered the figure of 10 million dead. And I just found this hard to believe. I then tried it out on 2 other sets of Chinese, and they said, yes, if you include the countryside, probably 10 million. I still find it hard to believe that as many as 10 million. I think it had been spotted in the population figures if it had been that much. But it was a large number. Not as many as during the Great Leap Famine, which is variously estimated somewhere between the upwards of 28, 30, 40 million people. Something which is far worse for the people at large than the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution was terrible for the party and for officials, and bad for the people as well, but not nearly as bad as the Great Leap Famine. But we don't have figures. And I'm sure there will be scholars in the future, Chinese and Western, who will try and add up the figures, and people are already trying to do it, with the publication of local gazetteers. And those are pretty well complete now, I think, and figures will come out. Alan, you have another one?
I know in the 60s and the 70s, a lot of foreign observers of China perhaps had an idealistic image of this revolution that was taking place, and they were forced to reassess over time. And you've been studying the Cultural Revolution so long. Could you talk a little bit about your personal evolution? Has it stayed the same? Has it changed? And if it's changed, why has it changed? And also, over the next 10, 20 years, how is our understanding going to change even further?
Well, to answer the last part of your question first, I think that it will, our understanding will increase as more local history is done. A lot of scholars are now burrowing into these local archives and finding out what happened between 66 and 76 to the peasants and to the workers particularly, but also to the economy and society in general. If you look at my writings over the period, I think I can say I was never someone who felt that this was a wonderful affair. I was fascinated by how Mao was doing it at the beginning, how he set up one and then another and they all fell. That was very intriguing. And I don't understand how colleagues or others in the field could have been deceived about the Cultural Revolution since, and say after it was all over, we didn't understand there was so much violence when there were in fact bodies floating down the Pearl River to Hong Kong. And people, refugees coming out who were telling what it was like. As with the Great Leaf Famine, you couldn't know the full horror of it until afterwards. But there was enough to know that this was not good for China.
Rod, I'd just like to perhaps contribute a somewhat pessimistic note. I don't think that the kind of statistics you were hoping for appear in the Fangzhi at all. And it's because at the grassroots level, nobody wants to think about it. I, of course, as you might know, interviewed hundreds of people in the countryside. And I have yet to find one who would like to, in any way, relive that period. The general strategy is to, if at all possible, simply not make it. It's too embarrassing. The way that the social fabric was ripped apart in the countryside, it's just mind-blowing for me to discover. What is even more mind-blowing is that if you look in the Encyclopedia Britannica under Cultural Revolution, in the first paragraph you will see the statement that this was primarily an urban event and had very little effect in the countryside. It had enormous effect, and an everlasting one as far as I could gather. Now, I will stop. That wasn't a question. It was just a...
No, it's a very interesting comment. I think, I hope you're wrong, because just for the sake of the historical record, I think Andrew Walder is discovering some things in the local gazetteers which give him some basis for a larger number than before. But obviously, you're absolutely right. People just don't want to, and partly because they don't think it will be good for them if they do.
The China issue of victim numbers follows the general pattern of what we will call genocide studies. The numbers will get bigger. In the study of the American Indian demographic losses after the Columbian encounter, the numbers have gone up from estimates from the 1920s continuously to today, from 2 million to something like 120 million, with a stronger evidentiary basis than the 2 million guesswork of 80 years ago. The number of victims of the Nazis, non-Jews, of genocide or cold-blooded slaughter have grown substantially. The number of victims of various Soviet regimes has grown. if China follows the pattern, I think the evidence is naturally inclined to produce larger figures.
Well, I don't know if that trend will apply to China or not, but it will only be found out if Chinese do the finding out. The highest estimate I've seen of Great Leap Forward deaths, which was 42 million, was done by a senior official who was entrusted by then Prime Minister Zhao Ziyang with going around the country and looking at 3 sets of records to try and determine in each province what was the total. And he came to that conclusion looking at the public security records, the local records, and there was a 3rd set of records I've forgotten. So yes, we may see, the figures may well go up, I don't know. But I suspect it will have to be in a different atmosphere, political atmosphere, and with Chinese historians doing the work. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry if I missed this because I came in late, but have you said anything about what happened to Tibet in all this?
What happened to, sorry?
To Tibet.
Tibet?
Yeah.
Well, I haven't said no. Tibet, many religious establishments were trashed. Monks were given the same treatment as people in China proper. And as you may know, Hu Yaobang, then General Secretary in the early 80s, apologized in Tibet for all that had been done, and actually not just the Cultural Revolution, but even before. So quite horrific things were done there, but by the standards of the mainland, it was the China proper. It was not anything extraordinary. In fact, you know, if anything, they got off lightly because it's difficult for the Red Guards to get there.
Professor McFarquhar, in the same vein as the gentleman's question, I was wondering what's been the legacy of the Cultural Revolution for Chinese Muslims, especially in Xinjiang?
Well, I've just been in Xinjiang, and I don't think that it's the Cultural Revolution particularly. I mean, it had its problems, the same as Tibet. Religion was attacked generally, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, and so on. I think that I didn't get the feeling talking to Uyghurs that the Cultural Revolution was some black cloud over them, but just that they felt that there was an inexorable process going on, and there was nothing they could do about it. But I must say that I deliberately did not hold many political conversations there. Thank you.
Harvard political science professor Roderick McFarka on his book Mao's Last Revolution. To read more about the author, visit harvard.edu and search his name. Book TV is brought to you every weekend on C-SPAN 2. Coming up at 9 p.m. Eastern on Afterwards, New Yorker staff writer Nicholas Lemon describes how racial violence challenged emerging black power after the Civil War. He's interviewed by history professor Herman Bells. Then, The God Delusion, biologist Richard Dawkins, on the existence of God and the politics of atheism.
Veterans Day is this weekend, and Sunday, Book TV has special live programming on C-SPAN 2. Beginning at noon Eastern, a live panel with 4 veterans from the Iraq War. They'll recount their time in Iraq, discuss the books they've written about their experiences, and take questions from viewers. At 1:30 p.m., Nathaniel Fick and Dr. Jonathan Shea discuss the trauma of war and what it's like for soldiers when they return home. And at 2 p.m., join a live discussion with authors Stephen Pressfield and Sean Naylor about their latest books and the war in Afghanistan. That's Sunday on Book TV. For a complete listing of programs and times, go online to booktv.org.
Next month on In Depth, spend 3 hours with former President and author Jimmy Carter at his home in Plains, Georgia. He's the author of over 20 books, including Our Endangered Values and the forthcoming Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. Jimmy Carter as author, December 3rd, live at noon Eastern, only on Book TV's In Depth.
In his book, Redemption, The Last Battle of the Civil War, author Nicholas Lemon says that after the war ended, a second war over the question of rights went on for years. He describes an armed campaign of racial violence that challenged support for emerging black political power. Mr. Lemon discusses the book with Herman Bells, a professor of history at the University of Maryland. Mr. Bells serves as a guest interviewer and is not an employee of C-SPAN.
I'm Herman Belts, and I am delighted to welcome Nicholas Lemon, author of Redemption, a new book on Reconstruction after the Civil War. Nicholas, it takes a lot of more research to write a small book or a short book than it does a long book, and you've done an enormous amount of research on this work, and it's a very active and finely written book. What is Redemption? What are you trying to do in the book, and what inspired you to write it?
Well, okay, the title is Redemption. The subtitle is The Last Battle of the Civil War, which I'll get to in a minute. Redemption is a word, I assume you didn't grow up in the Deep South as I did, but maybe you did. If you grew up in the Deep South and you're white, redemption was the word that was used for the end of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was viewed in the white South as a horrible nightmare of oppression, and when it was overthrown, that was the redemption of the South. So it was the reestablishment of Democratic Party rule in the South. That's the name the white South gave to the end of Reconstruction. And that's where the title comes from. It's meant, I think, ironically by me, but that's sort of the official name of the end of Reconstruction. And it zooms down on a series of events, mostly in Mississippi, mostly in 1875. And what I am doing in the book is telling a discrete and very dramatic story that's meant to support a larger argument, which is that Reconstruction was overthrown in a kind of terrorist campaign that challenged the federal government, and the federal government went back and forth on how to meet the challenge and whether to meet the challenge, finally decided not to. What got me to write the book, I had written an earlier book, I guess 15 years ago, that was set in the 50 years up to now, or up to then. And part of the book, a substantial part, was set in rural Mississippi. So when I was doing the research for that book, I was traveling through rural Mississippi a great deal. And I would go into small towns. I would go into the reading room in the local public library. And often there would be a local history collection, something like that. So I would go into the local history collection and read up on what had happened in the town. And very often there would be a dramatic account of the redemption, in the way I meant it earlier, of Mississippi back in 1875, told completely from the white point of view, usually put together during the 1930s. And the story of it just intrigued me and stayed with me. So years passed, I wrote another book on a completely other subject, and then decided to return to this and tell the story of the redemption of Mississippi.
Now, the word redemption is a religious term, principally, it seems to me. And the choice of that term, did it have religious overtones or religious connotations? And allow me to say that Abraham Lincoln was often thought of as the Redeemer president, and was so regarded by Walt Whitman. that is without Whitman knowing that Lincoln was going to be the president when Whitman wrote that for the Brooklyn Eagle in 1856 or 1850. The country needs a redeemer president. You start the book in 1873 for good reasons. So much had happened before 1873, from 1866 to 1873, that one might have thought that a different kind of redemption was going to be vouchsafed to the Republican Party, full of evangelicals and full of religious-minded men and women. How close, if at all, did the Republican Party come before 1873, and then from 73 to 77, to achieving what we would call a proper kind of redemption in this kind of setting?
Well, here we're into the world of, counterfactuals, what might have been in history, which is always a little bit dangerous ground to be on, but it's kind of irresistible to try. The reason I call this the last battle of the Civil War is, Americans are so familiar with the Civil War that it's a little presumptuous to say this, but in a certain way we've forgotten what the Civil War was about, because we're so used to the idea that the Civil War was a war to end slavery. So just to remind people of what may be obvious, the Civil War was very widely understood as a war to preserve the Union, or from the South's point of view, a war for the right to secede from the Union. It was a war over Union. Mm-hmm. Clearly, the issue that precipitated the Civil War, the main issue, was whether slavery could spread outside the South. But it's very, very important to bear in mind that slavery was not abolished until a good ways into the Civil War. Lincoln did not run for president saying, if elected, I will abolish slavery, and didn't enter the war saying, I am entering this war in order to abolish slavery. Events forced that upon him. He did it. The country passed the 13th Amendment, which, constitutionally abolished slavery. But when the war ended, the question of what kind of life the freed slaves would live, and they lived overwhelmingly in the Deep South, was unsettled. That was what Reconstruction was about, was to settle the question of what African Americans' lives would be like, particularly in the South. And that's what people forget, that important a matter was really left unsettled when peace was signed at Appomattox Courthouse.
Well, it was left unsettled. Looking to a somewhat broader perspective, or not so much broader perspective, that issues that were pertinent at the time, Reconstruction might be said to be about reconstructing the Union, hence the word Reconstruction, in which the disposition of the freedmen's question, or the post-emancipation question, was not only salient, but was essential. So while agreeing with you that to use the language that you use in the book, what would happen to the freed people was a critical issue, but it was so, well, indeed, inseparably connected to other issues that it was extraordinarily difficult to deal with and to isolate. And I don't say that you've tried to isolate it in the neat, tight narrative that you've written. You focus on it, although you do not isolate the matter. Now, the question that I would pose would be whether, well, really the question would be, what were the objectives, what were the aims of Reconstruction policy as we come into them in 1872 and 1873.
Okay, so here's where
things had gone on for a number of years, and it would be helpful.
Okay, so here's just a little catch-up that'll be unfairly compressed. Mm-hmm. The first phase of Reconstruction is usually known as presidential Reconstruction, and the second phase is known as congressional or radical Reconstruction. Right. Lincoln was assassinated, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, who's generally thought to have been sympathetic to the South, succeeded him. There were various schemes to take land away from plantation owners and give them to freed slaves. This goes under the slogan, 40 acres and a mule. Those were not done. Land was returned to its former owners. Gradually, the southern states went from being under military occupation to being returned to self-governance. But it gets more complicated than that.
With some military oversight.
Right. Most of the southern states quickly constituted governments. Those governments mostly quickly passed laws that tried to get black people as close as possible to legal slavery as they could without reinstituting legal slavery. The federal government then began striking back in various ways. It was through this drama that Andrew Johnson was impeached and that the congressional or radical phase of Reconstruction began. Essentially a deal was made with southern states, which is if they would pass the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which is the amendment that guarantees civil rights, they would be allowed to rejoin the Union, which had a whole series of advantages. So then they passed the 14th Amendment and rejoined the Union. That's 1868. Right after that came the 15th Amendment, which is voting rights, primarily aimed at freed slaves. That passed in 1870, although not overwhelmingly. It would surprise modern people to hear. So when you get to 1872, you have this situation. The heyday of the radical Republicans in Washington has passed. The 14th and 15th Amendments have been passed and are enshrined in the Constitution. Southern states have begun to move back to the Democratic Party, which was then the white party in the South, and leave the Republican Party. President Grant has just been elected to his second term, and there are a few Republican states in the South left standing. These are generally the states with the heaviest percentage black populations. And the whites...
Left standing with Republican governments.
With Republican governance. And the white Democratic political establishment in those states is very restless under Republican governance and begins much more aggressively to challenge it. And that's kind of where the book picks up.
In 1870 and 1871, important civil rights legislation was adopted to enforce the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment.
Right.
So one might say that up to 1870, 71, the enforcement problem had not been much thought about, not to say dealt with, because the problems, the Reconstruction problem from 1865 to 1870 with the adoption of the 15th Amendment was how to change the Constitution to recognize the realities of Southern defeat and black emancipation.
So although I'd put an asterisk on that. Remember that the Ku Klux Klan, first the Southern states had passed these constitutions that took away black rights. Then quickly came the Ku Klux Klan, which became very active in the late 1860s. And the federal government, the enforcement laws were colloquially called Ku Klux laws.
Mm-hmm.
So there was almost instantly the idea that the 14th and 15th Amendment would probably not be voluntarily put into law by self-governing Southern states without the federal government sort of putting a thumb on the scale.
And hence the Ku Klux Act was adopted, and it provided for military intervention, and military intervention did occur promptly.
Right.
And so, in a way, I'm supporting your argument that the crunch time came, you might say, after the heyday of radical Reconstruction.
Right.
And it's important to remember, too, that that heyday of radical Reconstruction involved the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867, which said in the bargain that you referred to a moment ago, here's the bargain, and we're going to make sure you buy into the bargain by creating military districts, 5 military districts with generals in charge, and those governments that were initially were called provisional governments. So that's pretty strong, pretty forceful, and that made a big impact on the Southerners, a negative impact, as well as a sobering kind of impact. So the enforcement problem really is dealt with, first of all, as you say, in dealing with the Ku Klux Klan. And we would agree, perhaps, that President Grant responded to that Ku Klux threat in a forthright way in pursuance of the statute, and did send troops to South Carolina. And some of the things I have been looking into suggest that that was a successful intervention, a military intervention, which implies that it could have been done again, if need be.
It's complicated in this way. The country was changing at the moment I'm writing about in the book, which is really the early years of Grant's second term. In the North, public opinion was moving anti-Reconstruction. Whites in the North were becoming more sympathetic to whites in the South. Very important piece of background. So whenever federal troops were sent to the South to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendment, it worked in the narrow sense. In other words, the presence of federal troops ensured that black people would be allowed to organize and vote in the South. But increasingly, every time it was done, there was an immense backlash, not just in the South, but increasingly in the North. So that in early 1875, Grant sent troops to Louisiana and also to Mississippi in response to incidents I can go into if you want me to.
Yeah, I know. You describe it in the book. Sheridan was in Louisiana, and they put soldiers into the State House to get rid of the white supremacist coterie for a moment.
So when Grant sent troops that time, there was massive protest nationally to his doing so, including by liberals. There was a mass meeting at Faneuil Hall in Boston, another at the Cooper Union in New York, to protest. The sort of liberal press establishment of the time protested vociferously. So it's a policy that worked, again, in the narrow sense, but Grant was not able to muster a broad consensus around it. So it creates the problem of trying to do something when there isn't a consensus.
Well, I agree.
There's lots of Iraq analogies that come to mind here, of course.
Well, we don't have to get into those at this point. But exactly on that, in the narrative, you seem to suggest that Grant had opportunities, and if he'd acted more forthrightly, more faithfully to the statutes, then the redemption would have been short-circuited or curtailed or something. But now in our comments here, you're suggesting that the political forces were being arrayed against him. So that would be unrealistic for him to try to do that.
It's complicated. It's very complicated. Your characterization of the book is correct. I believe, if you wanted to be simple about it, and I try to write what happened and not be excessively presentist in my treatment of it, or say, if only this had happened, then that would have happened. Yeah. Grant declined at the key moment in my story to send troops to the South. By our lights, that was the wrong decision. Had he sent, that he did not send troops meant that the election of 1875 in Mississippi was unfair and was, essentially won by terror tactics. So had he sent troops, that would not have happened. So that's the simple way of framing it. He knew that if he sent troops, it would have been highly unpopular. So I guess the way I'd answer your question is, Grant was a genius as a military strategist and tactician. He was not a genius as a politician. A political genius might have been, who had Grant's inclinations, which were to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendment, might have been able to muster a national consensus around that. Grant was not able to muster a national consensus around that. So he was faced with a very stark choice between I, Grant, can do what I construe to be the right thing, but it will devastate my party politically. And this is in the days when parties really meant something.
Oh, yeah.
So that was the choice he faced. And it was even more particular than that, because at this moment in my book, Ohio was having a governor's race and Mississippi was having a governor's race almost at the same time. He believed, we think, that if he sent troops to Mississippi, the Republicans would carry Mississippi, but they would lose Ohio because there would be a backlash against his sending troops to Mississippi. So it came down to that specific an issue. From what we know, in his mind, do I save Mississippi for the Republicans and lose Ohio? Do I save Ohio and lose Mississippi? And he chose to save Ohio.
Hayes became governor.
Yeah.
And in Mississippi, from 1865 into 1868-69, the white Republicans were stepchildren of the national Republicans. They had a lot of difficulty getting things that they wanted to deal with the emerging Redeemer movements. People knew that. Now, I want to say, though, I think your treatment of General Ames, who then became Senator Ames and then Governor Ames. It seems to me your treatment of him reflects the kind of sensitivity to the political dilemmas that the Republicans were in, and especially the Southern Republicans. They were on the short end of the stick, actually, because they were on the front line and they had to deal with the enforcement problem with not much help from Washington. It seems to me you treat Ames with reasonable sympathy. How do you understand Ames, and how do you think of him in your treatment of him?
Let's explain, just to those who don't know. We're talking about the main character in the book, really, who's a man named Adelbert Ames. He was one of the youngest generals in the Civil War on the Union side. He came from Maine, and he was a great hero of the Civil War. He then went to Mississippi, was the military ruler of Mississippi, then became a senator from Mississippi, and then governor of Mississippi. He was the classic, in the parlance of the time, carpetbagger. He was a liberal, white, Northern Republican, allied with the radical Republicans in Washington, son-in-law of one of the most prominent radical Republicans, and he sat atop a very substantially black Republican Party in Mississippi that was being militarily as well as politically challenged. And he had he's a complicated, mainly sympathetic figure who I chose to write about partly because his life at that time is very well documented, so you can really see what he was thinking almost day by day. And he spent this period pleading with his superiors in Washington to send troops to Mississippi and predicting with great accuracy what would happen if they didn't. And sometimes they did, and sometimes, and especially in the final crunch, they didn't.
Was he as good as they get when we're talking about carpetbaggers? I think you convey the idea that he was a cut above the ordinary carpetbagger.
Well, again, if you grew up in the South as I did, you were raised on the idea that carpetbaggers were evil. Now,
but you've disabused yourself of that.
Yeah, but I don't know, so therefore I don't know if it's fair to say he was a cut above the usual carpetbagger. He was certainly an honest and well-intentioned governor of Mississippi. You know, there's a tremendous amount of mythology about carpetbaggers being corrupt. And, you know, we can go through case by case. Some were, some weren't. Ames was often accused of being corrupt, but he pretty much won the argument and was able to establish in his long exile from Mississippi that he was not. So he's a sympathetic and well-intentioned figure. He, too, like Grant, was a military man who didn't have tremendous political skill. He didn't have the ability to marshal a consensus and build a working coalition. If you wanted to make an anti-carpetbagger case against him, it is that he and his family were not deeply committed to the state of Mississippi.
They were out of state. I mean, they left the state often.
Yeah, and his wife and kids never really lived in Mississippi and so on. So he was, in that sense, literally a carpetbagger, that is a sort of temporary resident of the state. But, you know, to me, he's a very sympathetic and courageous figure who led a remarkable life. This all happened, this all was over by the time he was 40, and he lived another 45 years or something.
Remarkable.
So he had a very eventful life.
Yeah. Reconstruction policy involved civil rights, first of all, recognition of citizenship, and certain civil rights pertaining to citizenship, and then culminating in the right to vote. And in the book you say, you referred to what we've mentioned here before, what kind of life, raise the question, what kind of lives would the 4 million former black slaves in the South live? And the answer to this, to quote your text, the answer to this question depended on the freed slaves' organizing abilities and on the reliability of their voting rights. From these two things, organizing abilities and voting rights, governmental power and then schools, jobs, and justice would flow. My question is whether this is not putting too much of a burden on the right to vote. It seems to me that the right to vote is one of those constitutional forms that, especially nowadays, we often hear is oversold and not as important as it once seemed. History is diachronic, and I'm bringing a contemporary thought and sticking it back in there, but the right to vote, how important was it? And could it sustain the burden of producing such far-reaching results as you referred to here?
Yes, I ended this process as a big right-to-vote person. So I want to sort of really push back on this. There's a couple of points I'd like to make about it. First of all, you know, if you look at this period, it really was literally a fight over the right to vote. We haven't gotten into a lot of the gory details of the book, but you know, people showed up at polls with guns and cannons and things like that and pointed them at black people who came to vote.
We have to take a break now, and we will resume this conversation in a few minutes. Be back soon.
Okay.
Afterwards, and several other C-SPAN programs are available for download as podcasts. More with Nicholas Lemon and Herman Bells in a moment.
Veterans Day is this weekend, and Sunday, Book TV has special live programming on C-SPAN 2. Beginning at noon Eastern, a live panel with 4 veterans from the Iraq War. They'll recount their time in Iraq, discuss the books they've written about their experiences, and take questions from viewers. At 1:30 p.m., Nathaniel Fick and Dr. Jonathan Shea discuss the trauma of war and what it's like for soldiers when they return home. And at 2 p.m., join a live discussion with authors Stephen Pressfield and Sean Naylor about their latest books and the war in Afghanistan. That's Sunday on Book TV. For a complete listing of programs and times, go online to booktv.org.
Next month on In Depth, spend 3 hours with former President and author Jimmy Carter at his home in Plains, Georgia. He's the author of over 20 books, including Our Endangered Values and the forthcoming Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. Jimmy Carter as author, December 3rd, live at noon Eastern, only on Book TV's In Depth. Afterwards with Nicholas Lemon and Herman Bells continues.
Nicholas Lemon is our guest, and we're discussing his important new book, Redemption, concerning the Reconstruction problems in the South after the Civil War. We were
talking about voting rights, and I want to sort of, I'm going to put a little forward spin on your previous question and say that what you're asking me in a sense is, today we tend to think civil society is so important that it may even be more important than voting rights. Why are voting rights all important in this instance, or are they? So, a couple things. First of all, black political organization in the South during Reconstruction was sort of platformed on top of a very vibrant civil society that was mostly organized around churches and religious life. And that, the vibrancy of the civil society enabled black people in the South to go from, 0 to 60, so to speak, in about 5 seconds in political organizing. These are folks who went from being slaves, chattel, to having enormous voter turnout in a space of 10 years and a very elaborate system of political organization through the Republican Party that was kind of built on a base of church organizing. Politics then, some would argue politics now, was a kind of bargaining session. Everybody voted. There was no civil service. Patronage and spoils were everything. And people were, not exclusively, but more than now, much more open about saying, I am in politics to get things for myself. And when you study the politics of the period, it's unmistakable. The very high level of political organization and participation, the very high level, much more than today, of how much people cared about politics. In my story, they're willing to die for the right to vote, and they're willing to kill to deny other people the right to vote. And what right to vote was meant to bring people was things they needed. So after you had the government fight, the politics fights in Mississippi about who'd get to vote, you instantly got to the politics fights, which are, would the state fund a school system for black people, and various other means, but that's the number one, of essentially empowering the black population. You end up with a wonderful natural experiment, although it's a horrifying natural experiment, in what happens when people have a civil society but they don't have voting rights. And that's the Jim Crow era. And, the result of the story I tell in the book was that a kind of entente was made, which was first informal and then was legalized, in which in the South, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery would be enforced. The 14th and 15th would not be enforced, although they'd be enforced elsewhere in the country, civil rights, voting rights. And as a result, most black people in the South didn't have civil rights and couldn't vote. And they were able to create a vibrant civil society, but they paid a big price in a lot of ways that I don't need to enumerate from not being able to vote and have representation and get the things that that brings. So I left this story kind of converted to the all-importance of voting rights. And it's also worth saying about all this, it makes you reflect on the civil rights movement, because in the period I'm talking about, when my book begins, everything the civil rights movement fought for and won many years later, almost 100 years later, existed. It was all in the Constitution. It was in the Constitution throughout the Jim Crow era. And everything really turns on, as you said, federal enforcement of the right to vote and other concomitant civil rights. The bookends here are Grant sending troops in early 1875 and then deciding not to, and then a long, long period, and then President Eisenhower sending troops to Little Rock Central High School in 1957, followed by sendings of federal troops and other civil rights incidents in the South in the next few years.
That's well said. The right to vote was important. It was a demonstration of manhood, and it was followed on military service, as people said during the war, and it was so deep, so contested because of this very centrality of suffrage in political communities at that time, which leads to a question concerning the Southern whites you treat the Southern whites as pretty much, the language that you use is living in a fantasy world inspired by race hatred, as though Southern white thinking was racism all the time. And yet, in our conversation, and I know from your research, and as I said earlier, the right to vote is constitutionally reserved power of the states, as regulation of the right to vote, constitutionally reserved power of the states, hence the 15th Amendment, extraordinarily important thing. And the 15th Amendment did not confer the right to vote, but the right not to be discriminated against with respect to voting, as you know. The point would be that it's hard to see the Southern whites as obsessed and living in a fantasy world to the extent that I think you convey in Redemption.
All I can say is, look, I am a Southern white. I'm a fifth-generation Southern white, so I know and love many Southern whites, and that's where most of my family is today. When you read the evidentiary record on which this book is based, it's almost impossible to find any white figure who isn't, by our standards, well, I don't want to even use the word by our standards. The ideology of white supremacy is very, very important in this story. You cannot tell this story, in my judgment, as a story just about a sort of intellectual argument over states' rights.
You can't tell just about that.
No. I think the key element, after spending a lot of time with this, there's a huge amount of stuff to read where the people who are holding political power, military power, journalistic power, are speaking in their voices at the time, and almost always they use the language of white supremacy. And throughout the book, a lot of the material in the book is about, and this is where fantasy comes in, the notion that they're constantly suppressing or about to have to suppress what they called Negro uprisings. And this is a big, big part of the story. That's just deep in the psychology of Southern whites, particularly in sort of plantation areas with heavy black majority populations.
And a carryover of the fear of slave rebellion.
Exactly.
And yet, slave rebellion was rare,
right. And
historians sympathetic to the blacks acknowledge that slavery in enslaved society, and if you want to say in the civil society that slaves were able to construct for themselves under slavery, they had subterfuges and ways of dealing, but not armed rebellion, because it was impractical and it was almost suicidal. This carried over into the Reconstruction era, which in a sense is notable for the fact that the blacks seemed to recognize the historical and kind of received limitations on them, but they were free and they were not slaves. Now, a question would be, if the racist whites were able to acknowledge the reality of emancipation, that must show that white supremacy is to some extent malleable and is contingent, dependent upon circumstances, which gets us back to the question of, should a stronger Reconstruction policy have been instituted, and could it have been instituted, which we've already talked about, and the political difficulties of it.
But that I don't know.
Once slavery is abolished, then the Southern whites want to get what they think consistent with their view of the world and their view of the nature of the black people. They want to get the next best thing to slavery, but they couldn't get the next best thing was a far remove from slavery.
They got the next best thing.
You may be unduly influenced by your Southern upbringings.
They got the next best thing. In other words, the system that prevailed for many years after the end of the Civil War in a place like Mississippi was not slavery, but it was not anything like conditions in the rest of the country outside.
But it wasn't legal serfdom either.
It was.
You say that in the book, that it was legal serfdom. But the peonage cases would be the closest to legal serfdom, and when they were tested, they were invalidated as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court.
Remember, though, that black people in most of the South, not 100% of the time, but most of the time, could not vote and did not have recourse to law. So just a real simple thing. A white person could kill a black person and be pretty sure almost all the time that they would not be prosecuted. In this book, you know, which is a very violent period, there's hundreds and thousands of black people get killed by white people, and there's almost no prosecution of that at all. That's a very, very big, important reality. If you know, if you're living in a situation where you know that another group has all the legal power, all the political power, and that a member of one group can do anything to a member of another group and essentially get away with it, it's not legal slavery, but it's nothing we would countenance or admire today.
And at this point, we would probably agree, legal forms and institutional forms can be overrated and can be overestimated as to their importance. We can agree that there is such a thing as a de facto dependency, de facto servitude, and the way it was put in the Reconstruction period, well, blacks are not the property of an individual owner, but they are the servants of the community. They're kind of bound to the community.
Well, or even more, it's more extreme than that. I mean, in the part of Mississippi that's sort of the heart of the book, you know, former slaves, this is sort of the plantation belt of Mississippi, many former slaves would remain, you know, on the plantation where they were slaves. Mm-hmm. Now, if the plantation owner were here, he'd say because they wanted to. And if the former slaves were here, they would say because there wasn't any other option. And so they were living in a condition very, very close to servitude, where they were on a, you know, crop sharing system. All accounts were kept by the plantation owner. The sharecropper had no legal rights, had no education and no access to education, and really had no way to get out of peonage. So it's not exactly, it was a system at its most harsh that was much closer to the slavery system of a white person having a kind of totality of control over a black family's life and fate than a sort of more general sense of one race versus another race.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, Du Bois provides, you might say, the central motif in his book. You quote Du Bois, or W.E.B. Du Bois, the prominent black civil rights and political leader of the early 20th century. In his 1903 statement, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Was the problem of the 19th century, was the problem of Reconstruction the problem of the color line, or did Du Bois say that in a somewhat different sense? When we talk about slavery, is the slavery reflection of the problems of the color line, so you get rid of slavery and you still have the color line? I want to talk about Du Bois and the color line. Do you think, what was he trying to say there? What about the color line, the problem of the color line?
Well, this was in a, I think this is what he was saying. This line appeared in an article in the Atlantic Monthly and then later in the Souls of Black Folks about Reconstruction. So as I read it, what he's essentially saying is Reconstruction was a failed attempt to create, to sort of determine what would be the economic and legal status of freed slaves in the South in particular, in the United States in general. Since Reconstruction failed to settle that question in a way that Du Bois would find acceptable, that sort of kicked the problem forward into the 20th century and put it to the country. I think what he was trying to say to the country was, you still have to figure out the answer to this problem, because it actually wasn't settled during the Civil War, and it wasn't settled during Reconstruction, and it has not been successfully settled when all the Jim Crow laws were passed. He was writing to an audience in the Atlantic Monthly, where I used to work, of kind of bien pensant northern liberal, white liberals, many of whom thought, when he wrote this at the dawn of the 20th century, the race problem has been solved because the Jim Crow laws were a good thing and they basically work and everybody's happy. And so I think he was trying to say, no, that's not true, didn't work, everybody isn't happy, and this problem is going to reappear. That's why it's a prophetic remark, because at the moment he was writing, most of the prominent voices in American academia and politics were saying the race problem has been solved, and he was saying, no, it hasn't been solved.
Well, then the problem of the color line is, in some of the key words you used in your response, is an economic problem, and it's not a question of race per se as an intrinsic character of human beings. I would assume that you would agree that Du Bois's solution, Du Bois thought there was a solution to the problem of the color line, and that is to eliminate the color line. So,
well, wait. I'm not sure exactly where you're going with this. First of all, Du Bois was a protean figure who went through many phases. By the time when he wrote this, he was a young academic. When he wrote his huge book, Black Reconstruction, he was a communist, so he sort of had a different take on it, much more of an economic take. Mm-hmm. But I think he would say in 1903, the Jim Crow laws have to go, right? Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yes, definitely. And I would, Booker, I know this is old hat stuff, but it's important, I think, because it continues to resonate. Booker T. Washington, I think, would say the problem is not the problem of the color line. The problem is the problem of work, responsibility, earning a living, and being able to support a family, to support that kind of civil society, or to participate in that kind of civil society. And of course, Washington was not oblivious of the disenfranchisement, but as you know, as I know, Du Bois was looking to the talented 10th to lead the people and his people, and to eliminate the color line, it seems to me. I brought it up because the color line is something that in our politics and society we seem not to have been able to deal with in a satisfactory way. I know that's a contemporary kind of question, but I might think that you're writing this book, like lots of history books, are intended to throw some light on contemporary problems. That's why that's where I wanted to go with Du Bois. He's still prophetic, and Booker T. Washington still has his advocates and supporters.
But what I don't mean people to take from this book, things are so much better now than in the period I'm writing about in the book. I mean, this book tells a sad story, but I mean it to leave people with an optimistic message, which is, at the end of the book, things are sort of so bleak, and they've gotten much, much better. So I would not say the situation between the races and the internal situation of African Americans today in 2006 is kind of, it was ever thus, you know, it was the same 100 years ago, it was the same during the period I'm writing about in the book. It's much, much, much dramatically better.
Oh, yes.
Civil rights had been, and voting rights had been nullified as the book ends. They've now been restored, and that matters tremendously.
Yeah. Now, about the...
I also think race relations are almost unimaginably better than they were then.
Yeah. Now, in the course of the book, you talk about mythologies and myths playing an important role in history. That's related to a branch or a strand of historical study these days called memory studies. And you have a quotation in here where you say that politics and racial attitudes get intertwined, and it's sometimes hard to tell how one influences the other. There's a kind of reciprocal influence shaping here. I wonder if you see elements in your book, or when you were thinking about writing it, elements where you might be calling on memory and employing memory, and some of the things that you say might seem to have a mythic character, or do things have a mythic character only when other people use them? Is yours you're a journalist as well as a historian?
I know what you're asking me. I mean, any writer who says, I am able to rise above the fray and just tell you the facticity of what happened is self-deluded. We all write from a moment. We all have consciousness within a moment. If we're telling stories, which I'm doing in the book, we're selecting which story to tell. And I don't think today, you know, there's a big difference between the public and academic historians. Academic historians have been working all along on Reconstruction, producing a very rich body of evidence. The public, there hasn't really been a popular book about Reconstruction in quite some time. It used to be a staple of popular history up through about 1935, and then it kind of went away. So I think those who were raised on those early popular histories which presented Reconstruction as terrible are, you know, fading from the scene now by virtue of age. And I don't know what people think about Reconstruction now. I'm consciously trying to make the non-academic reader aware of the period again. I am not consciously trying to create a new mythology, but I'm sure that, you know, it's impossible to write without trafficking in some of that.
Well, I think the judge from the kind of students that I teach, and I've been doing it for a while, and they represent sort of orthodox opinions, and they think that Reconstruction was a failure. I think because the historians, most historians, regard it as a failure. Now, I'll say that Eric Foner's book, is a fine book, even-handed. I myself don't think Reconstruction was a complete colossal failure, but a lot of reformist, liberal-minded historians have argued. In the 1960s, as you know, there was a period when the positive side of Reconstruction was brought out, and you do bring that out nicely in your book. But in more recent years, there's been a kind of negative attitude expressed toward Reconstruction. Also, it's become more minutely studied and disaggregated, you might say. So writing a popular history is good. I'd say your book shows the enormous odds that the Republicans faced, and it emphasizes the sheer brutal power, and as well as some of the some of the more conventional political tactics used by the Redeemers. I agree with you. There hasn't been a good popular, not at all, but there's been some academic books like Ken Stamp's book in the 60s that did get very wide circulation, and Eric Foner's book too. So, but I applaud you for the work that you've done. I like to, in conclusion, you pick up on some of the things you say in your notes at the end, where you say recent events such as the fall of the Soviet Union, ethnic conflict, terrorism, asymmetric warfare, weak states, democracy creation, and strategies for ending civil wars are all pertinent to the events described in Redemption. You say they're pertinent. Could you comment on some of the analogies that you have in mind and the influence that some of these events have had on your writing of this book?
Well, there's a, there was a writing of Reconstruction in the first instance by historians unsympathetically. Then there was a great rewriting of Reconstruction. I'm oversimplifying, essentially in light of the civil rights movement, seeing Reconstruction through that lens. I think there's fertile territory for academic historians to pursue seeing Reconstruction through the lens of all that list you ticked off.
Yeah.
I mean, just the most obvious case, well, first of all, in reading the archival record, people are always using the word terrorism in a way that is sort of jarring because you don't think of it as an 1875 word. So it's a book about terrorism.
It's a 1789 word.
Yeah,
That's
it's a
what it is.
Exactly. But you're not conditioned to think people in 1875 in the U.S.
That's
are going to be
right.
using it,
Yeah.
and they are using it.
Yeah.
Another obvious analogy is the war in Iraq, which demonstrates, as Reconstruction did, that when the military victory is won, the story is not over.
Exactly so. Democracy creation. I think that's very apt. And I would, I agree with you. These things, the contemporary world political context is something which is going to affect the way we look back, and it's already happening with the beginning of the Civil War, in which secession has a much more sympathetic, is much more sympathetically understood by a lot of people in America, but even more importantly by political theorists who are recognizing, and they can't help but see, all the secession movements. So the theory of secession is acquiring a certain kind of respectability, not in relation to the American secession, but the American secession will be examined in the light of contemporary theories of secession, as will, I'm sure, democracy creation. One gets the impression in your book that creating democracy, at least this kind of democracy that required racially impartial recognition of civil rights, was almost a fool's errand. Not, you don't convey that idea, but there was a famous book written
by Albion Touré.
Yeah.
But I would prefer to think it wasn't a fool's errand, but it's a very difficult project.
But people are going to say, in Iraq, it's a fool's errand.
Right.
And that'll put us into the culture bag where some people are apt for democracy, other people are not apt for democracy.
Well, it's partly that, and it's partly the idea. There's a wonderful book by a political scientist named Donald Horwitz called The Deadly Ethnic Conflict.
Yeah, I know Donald, yeah.
So it's his idea, which definitely applies to the story I tell, is it's not so much the question of are people ready for democracy, but the question of ethnic conflict and tribal conflict is so deep-seated that it's very hard to overcome.
We are ready to stop. I hate to interrupt you. Enjoyed the conversation very much.
Thank you.
And we'll appreciate your fine book.
Okay, thank you.
Created by cable, offered as a public service. You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Coming up at 10 p.m. Eastern, The God Delusion, biologist Richard Dawkins on the existence of God and the politics of atheism. Then recommendations on conservative books from Bookspan editor-in-chief Brad Miner.
Veterans Day is this weekend, and Sunday, Book TV has special live programming on C-SPAN 2. Beginning at noon Eastern, a live panel with 4 veterans from the Iraq War. They'll recount their time in Iraq, discuss the books they've written about their experiences, and take questions from viewers. At 1:30 p.m., Nathaniel Fick and Dr. Jonathan Shea discuss the trauma of war and what it's like for soldiers when they return home. And at 2 p.m., join a live discussion with authors Stephen Pressfield and Sean Naylor about their latest books and the war in Afghanistan. That's Sunday weekly for the week of November 6th. In its second week on the list, Senator Barack Obama tops the list with his book the audacity of hope. Next is The Innocent Man. John Grisham chronicles a convicted man's near execution for murder and his subsequent exoneration. At number 3 is Washington Post reporter Bob Woodward's third book about the Bush administration, State of Denial. Bill O'Reilly describes an American culture war defined by religion, race, and other issues in number 4. Next, Donald Trump and Robert Kiyosaki, the author of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, give financial advice in Why We Want You to Be Rich. That's number 5. Sixth is a collection of essays on aging by screenwriter Nora Ephron, I Feel Bad About My Neck. Suzanne Summers writes about the effects of hormone therapy on the aging process in number 7, Ageless. Premiering at number 8 is Thunderstruck. Eric Larson, author of Devil in the White City, tells the story of how an inventor and a murderer's lives collided in the late 19th century. In his memoir, The Life and Times of the Thunderbolt Kid, Bill Bryson describes growing up in Des Moines, Iowa in the 1950s. It premieres on the list this week at number 9. Rounding out the top 10 is Barefoot Contessa at Home. The Food Network's Ina Garten shares recipes and suggestions for welcoming guests. For more information, visit the Publishers Weekly website at publishersweekly.com.
Last week's Time magazine cover featured atheist biologist Richard Dawkins in a debate over God and science. Next, the science professor and best-selling author argues that there's no rational or moral reason to believe in God in his new book, The God Delusion. This is just over an hour.
Good evening.